In the course of video game development, programmers have a unique control on what can make it into the final version of the game, and sometimes they'll use this opportunity to include a variety of special messages. For instance, in the classic game Monkey Ball 2, there includes a level named Bumpy, which has a wholesome message written in Braille from someone named Jamad. Or sometimes these messages can manifest in slightly more aggressive ways, such as angry sentiments directed at the project heads, or even hilarious warnings toward would-be hackers and modders, which can only be discovered using special tools. These secret messages are pretty hard to come across in the course of Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games. However, there exists one game where some special secret messages managed to make it all the way to the public release. This is Dungeon Dice Monsters, an electronic version of the board game which is based on the small story arc seen in the original Duel Monsters series. This is honestly a pretty solid version of the game and was only the second Game Boy Advance title released on the platform. However, this hidden message wasn't in some random part of the lengthy tournament mode or in the specific game data. It exists in the very first part of the game before you even start. You see, Dungeon Dice Monsters has by far the best title screen cinematic in the entire series, with many scenes depicting compressed real-life images of the board game, a ton of custom pixel art portraying the duelist and monsters seen in the game, and even some custom music that goes along with it. But somewhere near the end, after the letters DDM appear, we're presented with many different dice icons rapidly scrolling in the background, and in the foreground, we can see a ton of random English and Japanese words that start traveling in different directions. Some of these are pretty easy to spot. For instance, we can see things that fit in nicely with the theme of the game with words like dice roll, combo, tactics, and Yu-Gi-Oh! That are readily identifiable. But there were also some specific phrases that I couldn't really figure out at first. This led me to repeatedly watching this part of the animation over and over again, and as I began to carefully comb through this part, I couldn't help but notice that there were definitely some of these phrases that were randomly added in and don't make much sense in isolation, but putting them together draws a much clearer picture of what the person in charge of this animation was thinking at the time. To better capture this, I was able to disable a few layers of the background, which made the words a ton easier to read. Let's start with one that is rather unmistakable and points us in a very obvious direction. If you look closely, there exists the single word, fetish. This one is pretty spicy in itself, as we all know what the modern use of the word is meant to signify. And while this could technically be in reference to the classical meaning of the word, which is somewhat related to a spiritual study of cultures, I'm 100% positive they meant exactly what I had in mind, as it's the only single word in this entire sequence that was removed from the Japanese release of the game and notably missing in the English version. Once I noticed this key difference, many of the other words slowly began to make sense. You see, the second word I started to pick up on was the simple word, miniskirt. Unlike our first word, miniskirt doesn't have much of a double meaning which it could possibly refer to. Instead, it's a pretty clear reference to an archetype of lower body garment, which have classically been associated with skirts that have a hemline high above the knee, and would start to become popular during the 1960s for a variety of reasons. Now, I'm sure you can already tell where this is going, but these two words alone aren't necessarily that explicit. I mean, miniskirts are pretty cool, and there's nothing really wrong with saying that you really like them. But as the rabbit hole gets deeper, it of course gets a little bit darker. The third piece of evidence, which doesn't seem to fit in with all the others, is the singular word, comic market. Now, this might not ring a bell to many of you, but is unmistakably a reference to a convention that only takes place in Japan, more often referred to as Comic-Ket. This convention happens twice a year and has taken place every year since 1975 and is specifically meant to celebrate and promote self-published works by independent authors and artists known as doujinshi. And while it seems relatively innocent, I definitely wouldn't go searching this term if you're in a workplace environment. Many of you probably already recognize this term, as it's primarily used in reference to created works of fan fiction and special artistic renditions of fan favorite characters. Comic Market, or Comiket, is basically the flagship convention when it comes to doujinshi, as it remains the largest and most attended event for independent artists. This convention has become a cultural icon for the fans of such works, and when looking at the credit sequence of Dungeon Dice Monsters, pretty much everyone who worked on it has a Japanese origin name, which would lead me to believe that someone on the dev team has a very passionate feeling about such works, if you know what I mean. Now, this third word was really important to figure out, as it gives us some special insight on another phrase I spotted in the opening sequence, which I originally thought was very random and impossible to decipher. Appearing many times is the message USR 01607 underscore RD1 colon FF27. Now, it's relatively obvious that the beginning of the statement refers to a username on some sort of website or forum, and was probably meant to be a random anonymous burner account. But the second part of this message was separated by a colon. And in terms of internet activity, this is commonly used as a way to filter options in a search engine. For instance, if you search on YouTube with any phrase followed by before colon and a date, it will only return results falling within that filter. In this secret message, it points to something with the title or subtitle FF27. This type of numbering code is very prevalent when it comes to books or magazines to document the sequence issue number. For this, we can see that it's obviously the 27th issue in some sort of work, and the FF is very specifically meant to communicate that this is a fan fiction issue created by the non-original artist. I did a ton of searching online for any reference regarding this username or work of fan fiction, but such reference is long gone in the depths of the internet. While this lead came up relatively short, we now have a collection of words that more or less points us to a strong preference of miniskirts, a love of doujin works, and a reference to a specific work of fan fiction. Now, we already have enough evidence to charge someone with, well, we'll call it passionate coding, but there was also another message appearing here that might give us some special insight on exactly what the individual was so passionate about. Here we can see an oddly specific date of 1974 5/12, and for all the American date format mains, this refers to the date of May 12th, 1974. Seeing that this game was released in 2001 in Japan and 2003 in the United States, it certainly stands out as a reference to something that happened over 27 years ago. This one really threw me for a loop, as I originally thought it to be the birth date of someone who had worked on the game. However, after Googling every person's name who had appeared in the credits in both English and Japanese, I came up with nothing. I then began to search deeply into the history of Comiket, considering that the first one happened in 1975 and was oddly close to this date. However, I was unable to find anything about what happened on this specific date. After searching for the specific date in nearly every place I could think of, I finally got a few results that seemed to also fit in with the theme of the other hidden words I came across. You see, there were 3 specific magazine issues that were released on exactly this date. The most prominent of them was a series called Shonen Magazine, and is generally known as the second most popular magazine series released in Japan. The origin of this magazine can be traced all the way back to 1959, and of course is mainly a collection of manga works with some extra stuff in there as well. For this series, the 812th issue would of course be dropped on May the 12th, 1974, and very prominently features the singer and actress Hiroko Hayashi on a cutout section of the front cover. Hiroko was beginning to peak in popularity around this time for the single Ho Ho Emi, which absolutely holds up to the highest of today's standards. Now, the second magazine released on this exact day was from a series called Shonen Sunday, which was meant to rival the wildly popular shonen magazine, and would similarly also have its first issue released in 1959. This magazine also features various manga series, with, of course, some pretty Asian girls very often appearing on the front cover. Their May 12th issue in 1974 would feature the singer Agnes Chen, who was booming in popularity around this time, appearing on many different magazine covers and even in TV shows at the time. No doubt another S+ tier waifu during this era. The last reference of this date that I could find was in a series called Weekly Margaret. While the word shonen signifies that the work typically caters to male readers, this magazine is considered a shoujo magazine, which are manga series which try to appeal to a young female audience with very light, vibrant colors and often with a more romantic theme. This issue, released on May the 12th, doesn't have a lot to go off of, and while it simply depicts one of the main characters of a particular series, it was the last notable reference to this very specific date that I could find. While this last one was a much more ambiguous reference, as it could refer to anyone from the covers or even a specific manga series included in one of them, I believe that given the context of the previous words, the chances that these issues are a part of this elaborate secret message is fairly high. So given all this information, with this specific collection of words, was this just a cheeky way to give a shout out to a waifu, or was this just one big elaborate meme? Let me know your verdict in the comments. And if you like this detective work, be sure to stick around to see what other mysteries I have yet to solve. I'm gonna go do some research on the history of Comiket cosplays purely for personal reasons, but be sure to tune back in for a thorough dressing down of the next topic. And in the meantime, stay clean, scrubs.